Ghost towns are abandoned settlements once bustling with life and purpose that now stand silent to the passage of time. Deserted due to economic decline, exhaustion of natural resources, or natural or man-made disasters, ghost towns tell stories of resilience, hardship, and the transient nature of human existence. As we explore what remains, we can't help but feel a sense of nostalgia for a time that once was, and a connection to those who once called these places home. Exploring a ghost town invites us to contemplate that what we see all around us is often short-lived and only temporary. In this video, we'll explore and learn the stories of 10 fascinating ghost towns across Western Canada, and to see what remains. First up, we will go back to one of my earliest ghost town explorations. The area first saw settlers arriving in the early 1900s. Bulwark was officially established as a village when the railway was extended north from the town of Coronation in 1914. The village never grew to a large population with only about 100 people, but it became a bustling center for the grain industry and was home to 5 grain elevators. 3 lumber yards, general and hardware stores, a garage, post office, 2 churches, a school, and more were opened in this small community. The railway that was to run from Bulwark to Edmonton was never completed, which most likely was the beginning of its decline. Construction costs rose along with the labor force of young men, which slowed with the start of the Second World War. After the war and with the rail line expansion forgotten, one business closed, followed by another. The school closed around 1960, and the railway was pulled up from Coronation within a few years. Most of the town and buildings, along with 3 of the grain elevators, were demolished long ago, with just a small section of the town site remaining. Many communities in Western Canada in the early 1900s met the same fate as Bulwark. They lived and died by the railways that serviced them. The remnants of these once thriving communities are a reminder of the men and women who risked everything by coming to Canada to settle and start a new life. Now let's explore what's left of the ghost town and mine site of Pocahontas in Jasper National Park, Alberta. Pocahontas began as a construction camp for the building of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, which began around 1905. Around 1908, a coal claim was staked here, and 2 years later, Jasper Park Collieries opened 2 coal mines here. Pocahontas was named after Pocahontas, Virginia, where they were operating a highly successful coal mining operation. Mine production was very slow at the beginning, but money was invested in upgrading the mine and facilities. A permanent plant was also built, and by 1913, production had increased substantially, with 250 people living in the community. Pocahontas was divided into 2 sections. The lower site housed the single men, as well as the mine buildings, a hotel, store, hospital, post office, and railway station. The upper site was where families lived. There was also a water tower, school, and community hall in the upper site. With the start of the First World War, coal production was high to support the war effort, but 100 kilometers of railway was pulled up, essentially cutting off Pocahontas. The mine continued to be highly profitable, but once the war was over, Pocahontas began to decline. There was a lack of rail service, and to make matters worse, the poor quality coal that was becoming more difficult to extract, and with falling market prices, the mine ceased operations in 1921. Some mining continued, but all officially stopped in 1930 when the federal government passed the National Parks Act, which banned resource development in the parks. As you can see today, not much is left, just a few scattered ruins that serve as reminders of a now mostly forgotten part of our history. In Banff National Park, Alberta, at the foot of Cascade Mountain, lie the remains of Bankhead, another one of the many coal mining communities that sprang up in Western Canada. The Canadian Pacific Railway had accepted coal supply offers from Canadian Anthracite while proceeding to gain control of other remaining land. In 1902, Canadian Pacific Railway geologists and mining engineers were busy on the slopes of Cascade Mountain, mapping the seams. The coal they found was classified as anthracite, at the low end of the scale. It burned well and so seemed worthwhile to mine. The main problem was the steepness of the seams, where in some areas the seam was pushed beyond vertical, making work difficult. Second was the waviness and thickness of the seams. Third were the faults that disrupted the seams, where they could just end abruptly. Difficult to mine, but not impossible, as this group had just completed Canada's first transcontinental railway, 6 years ahead of schedule. They had to make it work to remove dependence on an outside coal supplier. The Canadian Pacific Railway formed Pacific Coal Company Limited, and the mine was registered in 1903 as Mine Number 80. They took a unique approach with this mine. They mined upward instead of downward. They could also use gravity to bring the coal out of the tunnels. It required some clever engineering and good design for this to work properly, and was fairly complicated, with no room for error by the surveyor. By 1904, there were 135 men underground and 39 working on the surface. This number doubled by the next year in 1905. Carpenters began building the town site of Bankhead in 1904. It was designed and planned for 1,500 people. The buildings and homes were solidly built with quality materials. A fully modern town for its time, the population peaked at nearly 1,000. The First World War gave the town its most prosperous period. Bankhead coal was used in the boilers of Navy warships. It was preferred due to the small amount of smoke it gave off. 15 men were lost to mining accidents over the years. Relations between the Canadian Pacific Railway and the miners deteriorated after 1918, when a post-war recession made the owners reluctant to negotiate with union demands. Workers wanted the wartime bonus to continue and were determined not to accept a pay cut. A 4-month strike in 1919 settled nothing, and it all came to a head in the strike of 1922. They walked out on April 1st, and 2 months later the company issued an ultimatum. Back to work or the mine would close. The closure threat was seen as a way of ending the strike early, but the union didn't cave. Then on June 15, 1922, the news came. Mine number 80 was closed. It seemed the strike was a major factor in the closure, but analysts also noted a deepening slump in the industry. In addition, there was a year-by-year decline in production, expensive extraction methods, and other factors. The mine was most likely heading toward closure, strike or not. The workers remained hopeful that the mine would reopen once the slump ended, but it never did, and the Parks Commissioner ordered the Canadian Pacific Railway to remove the entire town. Everything had to go. Parks policies at this time were changing. Mining and prospecting in the national parks were being phased out. Buildings were moved out, many of them to Banff and some to Canmore. Bankhead was gone after only 20 years. Like many early settlements in Western Canada, many have been mostly forgotten, with very little written or hard-to-find history. Cairns is one of those places where I could not find much history, and the road to even find this place at certain times of the year is not passable. With many prairie towns that have disappeared, the marker sign is often the only indication that it even existed. All that remains here today is a general store and a building built around 1913 that served as a school, community hall, and church. The town was first settled by homesteaders in 1907. Later that year, the Canadian Pacific Railway surveyed the rail line and laid out the town site. Trains started running in 1910, and it soon became the hub of an agricultural community. Drought, depression, influenza, and 2 world wars took their toll on the community. In 1959, the post office and store closed, and Cairns soon became a ghost town. The rail line that is still active passes by the old town site, but trains no longer stop. In 2006, the lands surrounding the Cairns town site were sold and then donated to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The rail line passing through Sharples was built in the early 1920s and had 2 grain elevators. Sharples today has only 1 grain elevator standing and a few remnants of buildings and foundations. The one still standing is a Parisian Heimbecker built in the 1920s, and the other was an Alberta wheat pole that was demolished around the 1980s when the rail line was abandoned. Just to the west of the elevator you can also see the remains of the railway bridge, with only the concrete piers remaining today. This branch line would have been shared for transporting grain and also coal from the Drumheller Valley. When the coal industry in the area declined in the 1980s, this most likely also sealed Sharples' fate. Bence was established around 1930 along the Canadian Pacific Railway line connecting Purdue and Rosetown, Saskatchewan. The railway reached the area in 1929, and at its peak, Bence had several homes, a small train station, 2 grain elevators, a dance hall, a general store, and 1 main street. However, the town's fortunes took a downturn in the 1960s when the southern section of the rail line was abandoned, marking the beginning of its decline. The general store continued business until the early 1960s. The railway continued to run through Bence until the 1970s when it was eventually pulled up in 1977. The Saskatchewan Wheat Pole Elevator, a symbol of the town's economic success, built in 1928 with the arrival of the railway, closed its doors for good when the railway closed. It still remains on site today, but shows bad deterioration, and the top has now fully collapsed since I visited the site in 2021. The second elevator, the United Grain Growers, also constructed in 1928 and sold to the wheat pool in the late 1960s, was closed and torn down in the 1970s. The only other structures that remain in the town are a couple of houses, the general store, and other random outbuildings and farm machinery. Bence is yet another prairie community like so many others during this era that is now lost to time. In 1910, the Canadian Pacific Railway purchased a quarter section of land here, and Robsart was incorporated as a village in 1912. 10 years after the town of Robsart was established, it had a population of 350 residents and over 30 businesses. The town was so prosperous that it had a motto, "A town with a bright future." In the late 1920s, Robsart's decline began. Starting with a grain elevator fire in 1929, and then 1 year later another fire wiped out a large section of the business core. Next came the Great Depression, droughts, and falling grain prices. In the 1980s, locals and nearby farmers came together to restore the community hall to try to bring life back into the town. By now, most businesses were boarded up, and the grain elevators were demolished in 2000. Beaver Lumber is one of the few remaining storefronts from the once prosperous business area of town, along with a general store, which was moved to Robsart in 1961 from the village of Vidora. Several abandoned houses line the lonely and quiet main street into the community. One other building worth mentioning that you'll see when first entering the community is the public hospital, built in 1917. It closed sometime in the 1930s. In 2002, Robsart was dissolved as a village and became an unincorporated hamlet. Today, Robsart sits mostly abandoned, except for its last few remaining residents. When looking out over the stunning waters of Lake Minnewanka and Banff National Park, the last thing on your mind would be the thought of a ghost town. Under these waters is just that, a ghost town, and remnants of the resort village of Minnewanka Landing. It was the site of Banff National Park's very first hotel. Around 1886 to 87, Willoughby John Astley built a log structure and named it the Beach House Hotel. Soon became an attraction for visitors from all over the world. The lake was a source of food, leisure, and recreation, and the hotel became well known for the food that it served with the abundance of fish caught in the lake. With the increase in popularity, other hotels, along with more buildings and a wharf, would be built. In 1895, the government constructed a small log dam on Devil's Creek to improve the shoreline of the lake. In 1903, the hotel changed hands and it remained open until 1912. With the development of a storage dam in 1912, it was decided to burn the hotel to the ground before it would be flooded. The water rose over 12 feet and flooded nearly 1,000 acres of land. Many of the other chalets and cottages were moved to higher ground at the newly established village of Minnewanka Landing. In 1940, the Calgary Power Company submitted an application to dam Lake Minnewanka. In that same year, the Canadian government, under the War Measures Act, suspended the 1930 National Parks Act, which enforced no industrial development in national parks. With the suspension, it allowed the final dam to be built, which drastically altered the lake and surrounding area by raising water levels over 25 meters or 85 feet. Minnewanka Landing was flooded and lost. Today, divers can still explore the old town site and find many structures still intact thanks to the cold waters of Lake Minnewanka, which has slowed deterioration. The old 1912 dam can be explored along with many artifacts and structures from the old town site. Bridge supports, the original wharfs, building foundations, a cast iron stove, and more can be found. A must-visit destination for divers to experience this mostly forgotten piece of our history. Now let's travel out to remote British Columbia and check out one of the best preserved ghost towns in Canada, Kitsault. Located in northern British Columbia, this region has a rich history for its abundant mineral deposits. In the late 1970s, molybdenum, also known as moly, was in high demand. Molybdenum is used in steel alloys, enhancing their strength, hardness, electrical conductivity, and resistance to corrosion and wear. Between 1967 and 1972, a total of 10 million tons of moly had already been extracted, but market prices began to decline in the early 1970s. In 1973, Amax of Canada Limited acquired the site. By 1979, news of depleted deposits in Western Canada and the United States led to a resurgence in the moly market. In 1979, the mine reopened, and the construction of Kitsault started with a plan to attract workers to remote northern British Columbia. The The plan included the establishment of a community capable of housing approximately 1,200 residents. By 1980, the first families began settling into Kitsault, which had around 100 single-family homes and duplexes, along with 7 apartment buildings with around 200 suites. The town was equipped with modern amenities, including a hospital, mall, restaurants, bank, theater, 2 recreation centers, and a school. Everything that people would come to expect from a typical town in the 1980s. However, Kitsault's promising start was short-lived. In the midst of the 1982 recession and decline in moly prices due to byproduct production from copper mines, the mine shut down. By 1983, the last residents had left, marking a mere 18 months from full operation to closure. Unlike the fate of most ghost towns, Kitsault was not just left and forgotten. Over the next 22 years, the town remained vacant, only being maintained by caretakers. In 2005, an American businessman purchased Kitsault, investing millions in maintenance while preserving the town with a vision for future development. As of today, much of Kitsault remains frozen in time, sitting as it was in 1983. Company-built towns built around resource extraction in Canada are now mostly a thing of the past. While the future of this remarkable time capsule is uncertain, hopes linger for its revival, and we can remain optimistic that this won't be the end of Kitsault's story. Our last stop is Anyox, and is my favorite out of all the ghost towns I have visited over the years. From the adventure just to get to this remote ghost town to the stunning scenery and the fascinating history of this place, it was an incredible trip. This place goes beyond the back roads and is only accessible by boat or plane, and is why it has remained relatively unknown to so many. Anyox, situated on the shores of Granby Bay on Observatory Inlet in a remote region of British Columbia, Canada, is a copper mining ghost town. In 1910, the Granby Consolidated Mining, Smelting and Power Company, Granby Consolidated, bought land in the area. It would become one of the largest copper mining operations in the British Empire. The construction of the town started around 1912 by Granby Consolidated, and by 1914, with the mine and smelter in full operation, the population grew to around 3,000 residents. Ore extracted from the mines was transported by rail to crushers and then processed at a nearby smelter. Everyday life in Anyox was linked to copper prices, with safety and workplace accidents fluctuating based on market conditions. Isolated from road and rail, the town relied on steamships for transportation. Anyox had to be self-sufficient, offering amenities to attract workers and their families, including a general store, post office, hospital, bank, theater, and homes equipped with heating and running water. In the early 1920s, engineer John Eastwood built a hydroelectric dam standing at 44 meters tall to provide electricity to the town and mining operation. The dam, which replaced the original rock and log crib dam at its completion, was the tallest in Canada. To prevent overtopping after abandonment in 1935, the dam was breached with several holes to allow continuous water flow. The Great Depression led to a decline in copper demand, marking the beginning of Anyox's decline. Operations continued while stockpiling 100 million pounds of copper over the next 3 years that the company was unable to sell. In 1935, the mine shut down and the town was abandoned. Salvage operations during the late 1930s and early 1940s for the war effort removed most machinery and steel. By 1942, only a small crew remained in Anyox when a devastating wildfire swept through the town, destroying all remaining wooden structures. Throughout its history, Anyox's mines and smelters produced some 140,000 ounces of gold, 8 million ounces of silver, and 760 million pounds of copper. Since 1942, mining exploration companies have come and gone, and a company now mines the smelter slag pile for industrial abrasives. However, Anyox sits mostly forgotten, with any remaining structures being reclaimed by nature. It was an amazing trip with my good friend Mike and our guide Rob, and is an adventure I won't forget. There is still more out there waiting to be uncovered, and I hope to make the trip back there again in the future. To see more of Anyox and other ghost towns mentioned, be sure to check out the full explorations. I hope you all enjoyed a look at these 10 fascinating ghost towns in Western Canada. With so many more to explore, I can't wait to get out there and see what else I can find. So until next time, keep exploring.